Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar with the America-Israel Friendship League. My name is Naomi Reinhardt. I'm the Chief Development Officer of AIFL. I'm currently in Denver, so I'm wishing all of you in this part of the country good morning, and for everyone else, good afternoon, good evening. I see so many people logging in from around the US, around Israel, around the world. I see New York, I see Durham, North Carolina, Toronto, Aventura, Florida, Boca, New Mexico, Toronto, many other places. We're really delighted to have you here with us today for a very special briefing with the IDF. This is a very intimate and personal view into Israel and into the Israel Defense Forces. As we all know, Israel is facing threats, as it always does, from so many different fronts, some of which are longstanding threats, some of which are new, some of which are very complicated. And these include non-state paramilitary organizations, subterranean infrastructure, cyber threats, nuclear threats, and many more. So we're really delighted to have someone who knows about these challenges and threats more than anyone else, Lieutenant Colonel Amnon Scheffler, who really made a very special opening in his very busy schedule for us today. So we're really delighted to have him with us to tell us everything we need to know about what's going on in Israel. Amnon is the IDF international spokesperson. As part of his job, he's also the head of the international media branch of the IDF in the spokesperson's unit. And he is responsible for the public affairs and public diplomacy of the IDF, both in traditional and social media. He leads a team of more than 50 talented Israeli men and women. Before that, he was the head of the international branch in the IDF strategic division and the chief of staff to the military secretary to the prime minister. And he graduated from the Israeli Air Force Flight Academy in 2002. And throughout all this time, he's continued to fly with his F-16 squadron. So I think he's done a lot of things that many of us would be really excited to learn more about today. So Amnon, if you want to introduce yourself, if there's anything I didn't share with the audience about you before we get started.
So shalom to you all, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to try and share really our story from the IDF. I'm looking forward to your questions and having a discussion about really everything that you're interested in. And I think, Naomi, maybe as we spoke, I'll start with a kind of a overall brief, just give a few points of how we see the region and the main issues that we're dealing with, and then happy really to go into any topic or question that you wish to raise.
Perfect. And just so the audience knows, both on Zoom and on Facebook Live, please feel free to continue to share where you're calling in from. Please let us know, the last time that you're in Israel, any questions that you might have for Amnon, if you have upcoming trips to Israel and have questions about what you should be learning about, what news we should be reading, and how to find out what's going on really behind the scenes in Israel. And we're trying to make these webinars as interactive and participatory as possible. So please don't hesitate to share your comments and questions in the chat. So go ahead, Amnon.
Okay, so once again, thank you all for joining and for being here. And I know that it's coming from a place of caring and wanting the best for Israel and for the Jewish people around the world. And I would say even for the security and stability of the region. And with that, I wish actually to start from the region. And I'll start from Iran. Now, we can talk about Iran really for days about a lot of different things, but I'm going to focus about telling you two main things. And one is what we call the regional entrenchment and terror that Iran is proliferating around the region. And second is the nuclear. But I wish to do this with a kind of a initial explanation of how we understand really the back of all this and why it's happening. And I think it's important to understand that in order to be able to understand how Iran is acting and why they're acting the way they're acting. So the way that we see it, the Iranians have, since 1979, when they took over in the revolution, a mindset that they wish to continue, a culture like many other cultures that wish to stay and promote their agendas and their belief. Sadly, this regime's belief is something that is very different than the rest of the democratic world and the liberal world and our democracy. And they're looking to have a regime that follows the rule of the Shiite extreme religion. And because of that belief, they now need to stay in power. And in order for them to stay in power, they think that they need to do two things. And those two main things are both exporting the revolution outside of Iran and trying to fight the fight outside of Iran so that they can stay stable both in Iran and, as I mentioned, export the revolution outside. Now that brings to really Iran trying to fight, as they call it, against the liberal ideologies and practices, and how they call the US as the big Satan and Israel as the little Satan. And as many times, sadly, we hear them calling for our destruction and really the extinction of Israel and the Jews. And we see that really on a weekly basis. But what we also see is that on a daily basis, the Iranians are actually acting for that. And maybe I'll explain the way that they're acting in order to promote that agenda through different four, what we call in the military, lines of communications, LOCs. Now, the first LOC, I would say, is the ground line of communication. The Iranians are trying to promote this agenda through the Middle East, starting from Iran and going to Iraq. Sadly, they have been using the people of Iraq and the land of Iraq to launch a lot of activities, both by direct Iranians and different proxies like Kataib Hezbollah and others. And this could be launching UAVs at Saudi Arabia, at other targets in the Middle East. And this includes also Israel. And last May, the Iranians, via their proxies, launched a UAV to attack Israel from Iraq. So we're seeing how Iraq now, for the last 2 or so years, has been trying to battle this Iranian entrenchment, but they're struggling. And the Iranians continue to try and use the Iraqi people and the Iraqi land for that agenda, as I mentioned before. From there, we'll continue with the ground line of communication to Syria. The Iranians had, since the civil war started in Syria in 2011, and they were invited by the Assad regime to help Assad stay in power, they had a strategy that, as I mentioned, in order to get and meet their goals, they wanted to fully entrench in Syria. What does that mean, that kind of entrenchment? They had a goal of bringing in an air force and building air force bases in Syria. They had a goal of having a navy base on the Mediterranean in northern Syria. They had a goal of bringing thousands of Shiite warriors that will be able to fight from Syria, also within Syria, and from Syria mainly towards Israel. They had a plan of having intel bases in southern Syria, mainly close to the Golan Heights, so that they can collect information and intel on Israel. Now, with that, they have not been successful in as much as they wanted, because throughout the years, we have carried different strikes and operations in order to stop this entrenchment. We call this the short of war campaign, and the idea is both to stop strategic arms from being collected here in the area and this line of communication to transitioning them close to our borders so that there's less of a threat on a day-to-day basis to Israel. But also, it's to try and push away as much as possible, and hopefully forever, an escalation that could potentially be happening with the Iranians if they really entrench close to our border. I'll continue that ground line of communication, and sadly, we reached Lebanon. Lebanon is in a huge, dire situation. The Lebanese people are suffering from an economic, social, political, military crisis on all of these different fronts, which is just bringing the people to suffer more and more. Lebanese regular people. And a lot of what has happened in Lebanon in the last 40 or so years has actually been exacerbated by the Hezbollah. The Hezbollah is a terror military that is fully backed by the Iranians. They have about a budget of $1 billion a year that is funded directly by Iran, and it doesn't only end in money. It continues also to support in military tactics and practices and training. It continues in political backing. It continues in how they are trying to entrench and take over the state of Lebanon in order for it to be fully, again, kind of Iran, just here on our northern border, but again, exporting their revolution and being a battle zone that could fight for the Iranian cause as they see it here close to our border. Now, sadly, they have been building their force in a very extensive way. In 2006, in the Second Lebanon War, the Hezbollah was a terror organization. They had about 10,000 rockets and also warriors of different kinds, but to a certain amount of what they were trained to. Since 2006 till today, Hezbollah has built its capacity to coming close to 200,000 rockets, mortars, and shell. Yes, 200,000. That is extensive. That is a massive power that is more than many of the European countries, and more of them even connected all and combined. But on top of that, not only building this huge stockpile of rockets that can reach really all of state of Israel, they have also built special forces, and mainly, I would say, the Radwan Special Forces. This is a unit that has been continuously trained by Iranians, both in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iran, in order to do one mission, which is to kill as many Israelis. Nasrallah himself has come out with this plan of conquering the Galil, entering from Lebanon into Israel. They had a plan of doing this with using underground terror tunnels that they dug for over 13 years and put millions of dollars into the ground so that they can infiltrate Israel and kill as many Israelis that are living close to the border. And luckily, we, with our intelligence and other efforts, have been able to foil this. In 2018, we exposed 6 of these tunnels that were some of them on a length of 1 kilometer and just being ready to launch attacks against Israelis. Now, this is the ground line of communication. The Iranians are also exporting and proliferating their arms and their agendas and their capabilities through the aerial line of communication, flying in different materials and people and personnel from Iran to Syria to Lebanon and to other places. Also, they're promoting this agenda through the third line of communication, which is the maritime. And the Iranians, as we have seen in the last few years, have carried out a lot of different strikes through UAVs, through mines, and other capabilities against civilian merchant ships throughout the Mediterranean, throughout the Red Sea, and throughout the Persian Gulf. Sometimes they thought that they had a connection to Israel, but that was a very, very minor connection. And sadly, they brought to the death of 2 Europeans in one of these attacks on a ship that's called the Mercer Street, and really hurt the freedom of movement on the seas. The fourth line of communication is actually a virtual one. And this is how the Iranians are both transferring money and funds. And this what brings us to the Palestinian arena. The Iranians are supporting the Palestinian Islamic Jihad with a huge budget, and similarly also the Hamas terrorist organization that they're supporting with funds in order to continue and build their capacity and their capabilities. Now, these terrorist organizations in the Gaza Strip are mainly focusing on 2 things. One is building rockets that could reach and with the target of killing more and more Israeli civilians throughout the whole state. They're trying to build them to go further, to carry more explosives, to be more lethal, to be able to overcome the Iron Dome and other aerial defense systems that we have. Really, again, sadly, with one intent to kill as many Israeli civilians. And the second thing that they're putting this money and effort and knowledge into is into the ground, building underground terror networks that are there in order for them to both maneuver around the Gaza Strip without being able to being detected, but to carry out attacks from those terrorist underground infrastructure, shoot rockets, carry out attacks and infiltrate into Israel and other activity. Sadly, this is going against the people of Gaza, because instead of taking this money and, for example, taking it to buy tubes to put in the ground for water and sewage and build water desalination plants, they're taking these tubes and building them into rockets. And instead of taking cement and building clinics and schools and roads and whatever is needed, they take them and put them into the ground. Now, this cement, we see it in the opening in the shafts of these tunnels, and we can see how it has the stamp of an Israeli cement factory on the way between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, not far away from where I am right now. It's called Nishel, which is eagle in Hebrew, and we really see how they are using this cement instead of building houses and all the rest of the stuff that I mentioned for civilian use. They're putting it underneath the ground. Now, another thing that is horrific about this is that they're deliberately building these underground tunnels in populated areas. And they're doing so because they know that we both follow our values and our morals and our rules of engagement according to the international law of armed conflict, and that would refrain us from carrying out these strikes whenever we can, because we want to minimize as much as possible when striking military targets, any kind of impact on civilians that we can. And the second thing is that they know that if we carry out these strikes, because we have to, because there is a rocket that is just about to be launched against Israelis, and we need to strike it to stop that, that the international community will rise and criticize what is happening because of civilians that are injured in the way, or even worse, killed on in that kind of action. We are trying to minimize and find the best ways and solutions to deal with this horrific situation that these terrorist organizations have kidnapped the people in Gaza. And we do this through various different means for over 16 years that we have been developing these different techniques. And it could be sending a text message to a family that lives next to a terrorist infrastructure or rockets and telling them we're going to strike this, leave as soon as possible. And after texting them, we will call them and tell them again, leave. And if they still haven't left, we will use a small armament that makes a really strong noise so that they know and they will leave. And if you go on YouTube, you can find many movies that Palestinians have posted by themselves that show this, because they know to trust us. And then they stand next to those targets and actually can film them because they know that we will strike them accurate. And that is another thing that we have developed. How do we strike very complicated different targets that we hit them in a way that they will create as minimum as damage to its surrounding? We sometimes use a long fuse so that the explosion would be inside and the house will collapse inside with the rockets and the mortars and inside it, instead of really creating damage to the area around it. We will also always, when we're attacking, when we're striking Gaza, use only accurate ammunition. And when we do this, we always have a UAV, which is an unmanned aerial vehicle, meaning what militarily we call eyes on the target, looking at the targets themselves to make sure that only what we intend to attack is really there. And if a car with civilians, or someone forgot something in the house and runs back to get it, or a bus comes by, or something happens that isn't supposed to be exactly like we want it, then we will either abort the mission, take the planes back, go back and prepare for another strike after it's cleaned out and ready, or we will send the ammunition to another, what we call in the military a cemetery for the weapons, that the weapons will go there and refrain from hitting anyone that is not what we were intending to hit as a military target. Now, this is a very complicated thing to do. It takes a lot of means and efforts, and we do this proudly. But what I want to mention about this is that we cannot always do this. And I'll go back to Lebanon in just a sec and say that that is a complicated thing that we have there. But before I do that, I want to complete just this circle and continue to Judea and Samaria. Now, the situation in the last month and a half has been a very tragic one in Israel. We've had 19 civilians that were murdered by terrorists that carried out different attacks in different areas in Israel in cities, in Tel Aviv, in Bnei Brak, in Elad, and other locations, killing in horrific ways civilians. And this wave of terror comes on the backing of a lot of incitement that is promoted by these terrorist organizations, both, as I mentioned, Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, both from Gaza and from Judea and Samaria. Now, this has brought us to need to carry out different counterterrorism actions. We've carried out a few of these in different locations in Judea and Samaria, but one area of focus for us is Jenin. This is in the northern part of Samaria, where over 50% of the different threat streams that we see now in our intel and that we are aware of originate from. 3 of the terrorist attacks that I just mentioned, Tel Aviv, Bnei Brak, and Elad, that killed 11 people came from the Jenin area. And that brings us to continue a need to act in that area to foil and stop threats that are daily, that are ticking bombs. And that's something, sadly, that is happening because of the lack of governing and ruling inside Jenin, of a lot of criminal actions, but mainly of the terrorist organizations that are present there and that continue to promote carrying out attacks from Judea and Samaria. Sadly, during one of these events on the 11th of May, is also when the reporter Shireen Abu Akleh was tragically killed. We are still in the midst of the inquiry into figuring out if this was from one of the Israeli soldiers that was aiming to shoot at militant, or it was from one of the bullets, and around 1,000 bullets were shot out in that morning by Palestinian gunmen that were firing towards and on our soldiers that were acting to apprehend terrorists. So maybe that is another source of what brought to her death. If you want, I'm happy to elaborate more on this very tragic and sad event. And we're waiting and we hope to get more information and to be able to get to the bottom of this so that we really know what brought to her death. In any way, if it was from an IDF soldier or if it was from a Palestinian terrorists, we know that this is a very tragic event, and we know how we appreciate the freedom of the press and how we act in order to promote it as much as possible and to work with reporters to report on everything that I just shared with you, because we find it to be extremely important that the world understands what are the different threats and what are the different terrorist organizations that we need to deal with them here in the area. I want to conclude just to go back both to Lebanon and something a bit optimistic. On the Lebanon front, I mentioned the 200,000 rockets. And I believe that this is a major threat to Israel, to the region, but mainly to the people of Lebanon. And that together, all of us need to do everything we can in order to prevent any kind of escalation that could be brought by Hezbollah dragging us into a conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the situation that we can carry out the way that we strike in Gaza, as I mentioned before, is something that we won't be able to do because of the amount of masses that will be shot from Lebanon. In last May, in the escalation from Gaza, we had 4,400 rockets shot in 11 days at Israeli civilians. 800 of those were at the city of Ashkelon itself. What we are expecting in the next, hopefully never escalation that will be in the north, is about 4,400 rockets a day. And that means that with the amount that we have already put in effort and money in building a very extensive aerial defense system, we will also need to act to strike those rockets before they are shot. And that means that these 200,000 rockets will need to be striked. Now, the sad thing is, similar like in Gaza, this is an Iranian tactic. The Hezbollah is deliberately entrenching these rockets inside homes. On average, we can say that in southern Lebanon, every third house houses a rocket or a command and control center or different ammunition to be used by the Hezbollah terror military. And that means that we will need to strike and stop these from being attacking Israel. And that's something that we all must prevent. On the optimistic side, both thanks to the Abraham Accords and to Iran, the region is actually getting closer. We're becoming better friends with a lot of the Arab countries in the region, but not only. It starts also from Cyprus and Greece. We are just now concluding a month-long exercise of the Israel Defense Forces military. And today we are now having a huge training in Cyprus, thanks to also this cooperation. But it continues more than that. It's not just with these countries that we've had relationships for many years. It's also with peace countries, with Jordan and Egypt, that our relationship is getting warmer and warmer, but also continuing into Gulf countries that, as the Abraham Accords have brought with UAE and Bahrain and others. We hopefully soon will see IDF soldier based in Bahrain that will be in the 5th Fleet and the Navy of the US forces that is in charge of the Middle East. And we already have an officer that is stationed in the headquarters of the Central Command of the United States that is in charge of the Middle East. And imagine every day an Israeli officer going to work and meeting all of the different countries in the region, drinking coffee with them, but also building cooperation and bringing more stability and security for everyone in the region. And I mentioned that happens both thanks to the Abraham Accords, but also to the Iranian threat. And here, I'm going to end sadly on a more pessimistic side, and this is the nuclear issue. The Iranians are continuously building their military nuclear capability. They're researching and developing more modern and faster centrifuges. They are building them deeper in the ground. They are enriching more and more uranium in order to have a military nuclear capability. Now, that is not just a threat to Israel. That is not only just a threat to the Middle East. This is a threat to the world. Because if the Iranians have this capability, then also many countries in the region would want this. And this not only brings a race, but this also brings the capability of other terrorist organizations and others to be able to use horrifically this, and hopefully this will never happen, but different unconventional weapons. Now, with that pessimistic side, I will end and move to questions so that I can talk about solutions.
Thank you so much. And I know we ended on a slightly pessimistic note, but I do, appreciate the fact that there were some, snippets of positivity and hope and optimism, despite the constant threats that Israel has endured since its founding, decades ago. And I know that that's part of the role of the IDF, and part of your role is to sort of balance and keep in mind both the positives and the negatives and stay optimistic as much as possible. So I don't envy your position, but I applaud all the wonderful work that you and your colleagues are doing. So thank you for that. On that note, we do have some people in the audience in Israel, and obviously many of us who are Israeli, who go back and forth, who have family and friends there. With all of the recent violence and attacks that have been happening throughout Israel, including in major metropolitan areas, in areas where tourists and civilians spend a lot of their time, is now a safe time for people to go to Israel to visit? Should we be getting on planes? We're sending delegations throughout the year. Is now a safe time to do so?
So I would say yes, both because this is one of the most beautiful times always to visit Israel after the winter when things are a bit more green, but on the security side, it is safe. And we have been carrying out, as I mentioned, counterterrorism activities that have already been proving themselves to bring more safety. Tfu, 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 as we say. It's been already a few weeks since we had the last lethal terrorist attack. And that is both because we're able to foil many of them. And also, this period came in a connection to other events that are happening. Some on the calendar, like holidays as the Ramadan, that create more tension for different various reasons that if you wish, I can definitely elaborate on. And crossing actually the last Sunday after the March of the Flags in Jerusalem, that was one of the events that sadly Hamas used in order to launch the last escalation from Gaza. We have been able to monitor and find the ways to thwart this from escalating. Yet I'm saying this, and always we need to be very careful. The situation is volatile, generally, mainly in Gaza. And what we're trying to do in the way to balance that is both, as I mentioned, counterterrorism activity, but also civilian policy. And here I'll go also to something a bit more optimistic that I think is important to notice. We've been promoting a lot of different civilian actions, and I will name just a few of those. Workers to come in from Gaza. The working situation in Gaza is that there's about 50% unemployment, mainly in the young generation. And they are wishing to come to work in Israel, because each day that they cross into Israel and work here, they make about $200 a day. That can feed about 6 families in Gaza. Now, this brings stability, because the people understand that if tensions arise and the situation will be worse, then they won't be able to cross into Israel. And this is one of many different actions that Israel is taking in order to both promote the civilians and try to recruit them to be a pressure against activity of terrorism and violence. And we're seeing that it's both fruitful from the Gaza Strip and also from Judea and Samaria. So Naomi, to go back to your question, I think both, of course, everyone is invited, but it's also a great time and it is safe to come.
That's great. So we'll get back on those planes. Thank you. We're getting a lot of questions about the the reporter who was killed recently, covering the violence in Israel, and a lot of questions about why people are quick to blame Israel. Many of us may not be surprised, since that has happened before, where Israel is blamed when it's uncertain who actually was responsible for the bullet that was responsible for her death. What is Israel doing to investigate? I know that you said that they're still in the midst of the investigation. And how should we respond to those who are quick to point the blame at Israel? As someone in our audience mentioned, she was covering a battle. And, when reporters are in a battlefield, this can happen and has happened. So how do we, first of all, minimize future deaths of reporters, if at all possible, and, prevent in the future Israel being blamed and going sort of more on the offensive instead of the defensive in those situations?
So I'll start again. This is a tragic event. A reporter that dies, and it shouldn't happen in that sense. I think it reflects in a very proud way what we stand for. And we believe in the freedom of press, not only because it's the law in Israel, because it's our values. And I think that you can see, and this is my day-to-day job, the amount of reporters that are here in Israel. We have hundreds of reporters from all around the world that are stationed here and carry out their work in very complicated areas of violent riots, of violent events like the one that Shirin was killed in. And we do everything in order for them to be able to carry out their important work. In order to do that, we train our soldiers, both to what the values and the protocols are, but also how to behave when you see a reporter. And I think that is something that we need to continue and sharing and promoting and debriefing and learning from more and more how we do better. But going back also to some of the remarks that you mentioned, I think that sadly, as you said, we see the world judging and very quickly and jumping into conclusions that cannot be reached without a proper investigation. And the main thing that I wish for everyone to notice in this sense is talking about the targeting, the intention. No one, and I am talking here mainly if I look at the CNN reports or others, and I've been speaking to their editors and trying to get them to understand that what they did is extremely poor journalism. And it's baffling to me that how they can come to a conclusion about what an intent of a soldier was. Of course, and they say it's based on people that are on the ground. And I think that they need to, first of all, question those people what their intent is. And we know that many of them that were speaking in the article that the CNN put out are extremely biased and have called for terrorist activity and supported the BDS and other movements that call for the destruction of Israel. And I think that's wrong from a journalistic perspective, both to use these kind of biased people, but also to kind of assume things without having the facts and being a professional in asking questions to counter that. And I'm very proud to say that the chief of the general staff of the IDF himself has been dealing with this issue from the moment we learned about it, the morning of the 11th of May. And he has come out just last Thursday in one of our commanding's graduation and gave a very long speech that I recommend everyone to see, but there's 5.5 minutes in it that he speaks about Shirin. And he says, there's one clear thing that we know about this event, that there was no intent of harming the journalists, that maybe we're the ones who carried out the shot, maybe we're not. But if it's us, we know that there was no intent. Now, we don't know who really carried out the shot because the Palestinians are not willing to cooperate. Now, we have done an unprecedented thing, and we have invited both the Palestinians and the Americans to come together and analyze this bullet and see what is the source. We know exactly where our soldiers were. We know how many bullets each of them shot. We know what they aimed for. We know what is the rifle that carried out the potential shooting that brought to the death of Shirin. Now, it's still a potential because if we had that bullet, we could match it with that barrel. But the Palestinians are continuously refusing to cooperate and get to the bottom of this. And I think, just to conclude this point, and again, if you wish, I can elaborate on this more, is a poor reflection of what the media is doing in not calling them out, in not saying, Palestinians, if you want to really find the truth, come and cooperate, and not talking about really what is the freedom of press in the Palestinian territories, in areas A or in Hamas, but rather they're jumping to conclusions very quickly towards and against actually the IDF that has come from the beginning and said this is both tragic, and if it is us, we will take full responsibility for it.
Thank you. And if we have time, we can ask more questions about that topic later. Many of us got the, in my opinion, positive news alert yesterday from many news sources about the new free trade agreement between Israel and the UAE, which I know is the first of its kind. There have been other agreements, as you mentioned, throughout the Middle East, throughout the Arab world, but this, I believe, is the first free trade agreement with another country. And I know that question has come up in our audience today. If you can elaborate a little bit, if you know how that happened, what that bodes for both Israel and the UAE and the rest of the Arab world. Does this foretell future free trade agreements of the kind? And, is this all good news for Israel? So
again, this is, I think, great news. It's less of my realm because this is really on, the more on the policy and political and not on the security IDF. But I wish to use this opportunity to talk about the growing of cooperation with the different countries in the Middle East. And one of the extremely beautiful things is that we're seeing that this is not only happening on the security underneath the radar kind of cooperation, but also on the civilian level. And that is something that is really great and wonderful people-to-people relationships that are growing. But back to the security, we have carried out dozens of trainings throughout the area, in the Navy, in the air, and in other departments, bringing collaboration with the UAE and Bahrain and other countries here. Most of the time, it's backed with American support and invitation. And this kind of training is both getting us stronger in a military perspective to be better at what we need to do to defend our peoples and our countries, but also it shows something of what I was talking before towards Iran. And that is part of the cooperation is to stop the Iranian exporting and using its proxies around the region and foiling their attempt to hurt all of the region and destabilize the whole region.
Yeah, thank you. Several people in the audience have also been asking about the next generation of missile defense, namely laser systems. Someone else asked about the formation of a National Guard. I know the IDF is the best, if not one of the best in the world at what it does, but are there new systems like that, new defense strategies, new resources that Israel is developing, anything that you can share with us that's not confidential, obviously, that the audience might be interested to learn about?
So thank you for this question. And if I may, I'll just take it a bit wider than that and elaborate a bit on how our aerial defense array actually works. We've been building for over 35 years a very extensive military aerial defense array. And we start actually from the Arrow. The Arrow is the highest branch of defense that we have, and it actually needs to defend from very far away threats, rockets and missiles that can be shot from over 1,000 kilometers, that could be carrying conventional and unconventional warheads. And we intercept them out of space, and that mainly can defend Israel from Iranian rockets, as for example. Underneath that layer, we have the David Sling. This is a rather new system that has been researched and developed together with the Americans, similar to the Arrow. This system is used mainly to protect from precision-guided missiles, cruise missiles in distances of about 500, 600 kilometers, or different threats that can be launched like UAVs from all around the Middle East. Underneath that layer, we have the Iron Dome. And as many of you know, the Iron Dome is mainly targeted in intercepting threats that are distances from about 50, 100 kilometers, but also much, much smaller. And one of the things that we're continuously doing in all three of these layers is developing them to newer models that are capable of dealing with the new threats that arise. So the Arrow, we just recently had a flight test in Alaska that was very successful of the Arrow 3, and we're now developing already the Arrow 4. The David Sling is, as I just mentioned, a new system that we're continuously growing in its capabilities. And the Iron Dome, the most recent capabilities that have been upgraded are actually the ability to intercept UAVs, the ability to intercept unmanned aerial vehicles. Now, this is a growing threat throughout the whole region. The Iranians are proliferating this to their proxies in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and carrying out almost daily strikes on different targets that they wish throughout the Middle East. So it's a very important component that we have upgraded the Iron Dome, and it's already been successful in intercepting these kind of threats. Now, underneath that is a layer that maybe I think that's what you were asking also, is the laser. And the laser is something that is still being developed. The idea behind it is that it could do two main things. One is intercept very small distances between where it's launched to where it's going to hit, because we don't always have enough time for the interceptors of the Iron Dome to catch those rockets or mainly mortars that have a short range of flight. So that will be dealing with those, and that's a very important threat that we have been looking for different ways to deal with. The second thing is that it's much cheaper. The Iron Dome interceptors are extremely expensive, and we're proudly putting a lot of money in defending our people. And this is generally how the country has put a lot of percentages of our GDP into our security agencies, and a lot of it goes into the missile defense. So this will also be an important source of how we can hopefully save also some money. That is the aerial defense system. It doesn't end there. We have continuously also upgraded our different capabilities on the ground and shelters and sirens and different mechanisms to safeguard our people.
Wonderful. And we're also grateful for the Iron Dome and for the funding, obviously, that goes into that, because I know how many lives it saves on a regular basis.
It's extremely. And if I may, on that point, just add, the cooperation and the backing that comes from the US on these systems is extremely important and saves lives. And this is not just a saying that we say that it saves lives both of Israelis and also both of Palestinians, because that capability of protecting us and carrying out all those accurate strikes that I mentioned, that I said before, and having that ability to take the time and when we need to strike it in different ways is extremely important, and that is thanks to these developments and this support.
Yeah, I think many of us would agree with you. We have many questions as well in the audience about Ukraine, which I know is another terrible conflict that's happening, obviously, in many of our hearts and minds right now. Many of our audience obviously have connections to that part of the world as well. I know Israel has been very active on the ground, trying to help those who want to immigrate and make Aliyah into Israel, as well as just supporting the Ukrainian people in general. What is going on that front? Is there any change that we should know about in terms of the Israeli involvement there? And another question was, has Israel learned anything from this conflict, from the Ukrainian experience? Someone compared what Ukraine is dealing with Russia to what Israel deals with its neighbors. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
First of all, it's a very tragic, really war. How Russia has launched this war on the Ukrainians, and we have, as you mentioned, as a country and as a military, been trying to aid mainly in the areas of medical support that sadly we have a lot of experience and are able to send to different areas of destruction and of tragic events of this kind and others. I think that we are looking into learning a lot from this event, and we are continuously evaluating what could be taken. And I wish to point out two things. One is that the way that some of this fighting is happening is actually teaching of what is the difference between a very organized, maybe old style kind of military that needs to be able to fight against small groups. And that is a balance that for many years we have been looking at how we can deal with the complexities of terrorist organizations that fight in small groups. And it's always a challenge for a mobilized military like the IDF. And we've learned many from our different experiences. And that's something that we're looking at. The second thing that I would say, and it's more in my realm also, is what's happening on the media front. And I think that we have seen how when the media is with you and the people are backing you and telling the stories of the people of Ukraine, then how the world also comes to their support. And that's something that I would have been very happy to see, that kind of support and understanding come also towards Israel. And it's something that I'm looking to understand and learn how to do better also from our side, and what's being done in a good way, I think, by the Ukrainians.
Yeah, on that note, as always, we have so many questions, and it's a question on my mind all the time, is how can Israel do a better job at Hasbara, or at promoting itself and telling all the wonderful and beautiful stories? I know at the America-Israel Friendship League, we try to do that through our webinars, through our delegations, through our exchanges and other programs, but we can't reach everyone. How do you, in your role, how does the IDF, how does Israel at large do a better job, frankly, at educating the world? Not only those of us who are already in the tent, so to speak, and who are pro-Israel and who love Israel, but those who may not understand Israel, haven't spent time there, maybe somewhat naive about the country, and only read certain news outlets or get information from their friends who have one point of view. How do we do a better job at promoting the Israel story?
So Naomi, first of all, thank you and everyone else here, because I think that you all care, and that's why we're here together to continue and trying to do that in a better way. So I appreciate all the work and just that you all know really here at the IDF and personally, it's extremely important and we deeply appreciate it. Now, with that being said, I think I am both looking to hear answers from you and learn because we know that it's a huge challenge. And as I mentioned in regards to Ukraine and Russia, I think the challenge is not only ours, it's a challenge that the world is now dealing with balancing out between truth and fake and spins and a lot of really misunderstanding and simplistic ways of looking at things that are complicated in many ways. And one of the things that we try to do is to explain these complexities and to be able to share what we see and what we understand. I've found that the most important thing and really our greatest asset and tool is to continue saying the truth and stick to our truth and share our stories in an open and transparent way, be as frank and quick as possible in sharing it. But we have also the responsibility in doing it in a very accurate way, which makes it hard many times to find and to stand to the truth. And we just spoke about the tragic event of Shirin and how much effort we're putting into finding really the answers. And as we said from the beginning, if it's us, it could be us. We will take the responsibility for it. And I think that by itself reflects what our morals and our values are. And that's what I think that we need to continue speaking about and sharing with the world.
Is there anything that our members, they want to help and they want to know what they can do? Is there anything that we can do outside of Israel to help you in your role and to help the IDF and to help Israel promote its story even better?
I would be grateful if we, all of us, for a lot of different reasons, not only for promoting the stories of the IDF or of Israel, is stand to the truth and ask the difficult questions. Tell the CNN, how can you say this? Let's be really critical and do good journalistic work. Tell different organizations that are promoting lies or really inflammatory and really inciting to violence. What do they stand for? Look at the freedom of press, as I mentioned before, in Gaza, and tell me, are you doing something good to promote the people of Gaza, for them to have a better life? Because if they don't have freedom of press and the stories don't come out there, there's one thing that I ask many reporters, have you shown one rocket being launched from Gaza towards Israel? And the answer, Sandy, that I always get is that the answer is no, because there hardly are pictures that we did not take, because the photographers and the reporters on the ground in Gaza are afraid of taking those pictures. But there were 4,400 rockets of them that were shot during 11 days. There were many opportunities to take those pictures. And I think that if we stand and care for all the people and say, let's do the best for them also, ask the hard questions and make them really answer in the world to see if we want to do better, then it can't be in this biased way and it can't be targeted against Israel. It should be looking really for the truth and for doing good for all the people in the area.
Well, I know so many members of our audience try to do that in their own small way, as do we as an organization, and we'll continue to work as hard as we can and brainstorm and partner and communicate and collaborate with others to try to help, tell the positive and beautiful side of Israel. So it's wonderful that we have you as a partner and the IDF as a partner, and I'm looking forward to future collaboration on that front. I don't want to end on a sad note, like you said, but we are getting a lot of questions about Iran, which I know has just been, a looming threat for so many years for Israel. What are you doing that we don't know about to prevent a nuclear attack? What happens if we find out, as some people are asking it, that Iran has a bomb that's a month away? How do we make sure Israel stays safe with that such a large threat looming over the horizon?
So for many, many years, we have been seeing the goal of the Iranians to build and have the capacity of a military nuclear capability. Now they are in a very problematic stage where what we call is a threshold state, because they are not there yet, but they are a few weeks away from having enough enriched uranium to have the capacity to build for a nuclear bomb. In order to have a nuclear bomb, you need to do, in a simplistic way, three things. You need to have enough fiscal material, in this case, enriched uranium. You need to have something that can explode that material and something that can carry it. That could be a rocket or a plane or a bomb of some sort. And the Iranians are now focusing on the first stage in a very extensive way. That is the modern centrifuges and others. Now, why did the world choose to try and stop this stage? Because the second and the third stage are really hard to monitor, because a bomb could be also something that can be conventional, or a carrier could be any kind of plane or a satellite launcher. So the dual use and the fast and speed of the second and third stage are really hard to monitor. And that's why we have focused on the first one. And what we should be trying and continuing doing is three things. And this is what Israel has said again and again. If it's a deal or if it's not, what we need to do is we need to, first of all, stand together. And the world needs to come together and say, we are not going to allow the Iranians to have nuclear military capability, because the threat of this regime holding such a dangerous tool is just not something that we, the world, are willing to see. The second thing is for that united front to come and say, we're willing to do everything to stop this. And we mentioned sanctions many times, and I think we are now seeing the power of sanctions wherein they are united against Russia. That similarly can happen with the Iranians. If the world says we are really in this together, and we haven't seen this yet, then that can also bring the Iranians to stop. And the third thing is to have a real military option on the table. Hopefully we will never use it. Hopefully we will never need it, because the first two stages will do that for us. But if that is needed, then that we are serious about it in a collaborative way, and that we're able to carry out that. Now that's what we see from the world. But Israel, as always, we say that we know that we need to trust ourselves and be able to defend ourselves by ourselves. And that's something that we're continuously developing, our different capabilities. I mentioned before the aerial defense array, but also our capabilities to stop in other methods and ways that you will all understand why I can't elaborate about them right now, but we are continuously working and developing them on all different kinds of fronts. We just allocated a certain budget from the government to the IDF to work specifically on the Iranian issue. We have upgraded a lot of our different departments and components on the intel, on the Air Force, and everything we can in order to be ready if we need also to have that third component by ourselves. Now, hopefully, of course, that will never happen. And the first two can stop Iran if the world comes together against that.
Thank you for that. And again, I appreciate your optimism and all the hard work that you're doing in the background. There's some aspect of what the IDF does that we do get to hear about from those that we know who are in the IDF or who have served in the IDF. I know many Israelis are currently doing their reserve duty in Israel right now. So we do hear a lot about what goes on, but we don't hear all the really interesting, fascinating, and important work that you do behind the scenes. So again, thank you, Amnon, for the extraordinary work that you do, that your colleagues do. If there's any final words that you want to share, I want to give you that opportunity before I conclude the program.
Okay, so just again, really, I deeply appreciate this opportunity, but more important than that is the work and the support that is extremely important and becomes more and more important every day because of the state that we are in the world and how things are told and in an unfactual way, in an untruthful way. And if we continue standing to both our values in an honest way and defending them, then we will win, and we will win together. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. And I also want you to know that you've gotten so many accolades and praise from our audience who, want more of you. So we'll have to bring you back for future webinars. You've spoken so clearly and lucidly and really given people an insider's view that they haven't seen in many other places. So again, thank you for your time and your insight today. It was a pleasure. I want to invite all of you to join us at our next webinar, which will take place next Wednesday, June 8th, for the 3rd annual Tel Aviv Playwriting Contest, where you will not only get a front row seat to enjoy 3 new productions, but you will also be able to vote for the best of during the program, which is a unique opportunity that we here at the America-Israel Friendship League are offering to you. Again, we offer our webinars really regularly every Wednesday or Sunday of every week. All of our programs are recorded both on YouTube and on our website. As I know my colleagues have put in the chat, please email us at webinar@aifl.org if you'd like a copy. You can also, of course, go to the website or to YouTube anytime to view this recording and all of our past recordings, including our past IDF briefings that we've been able to provide for you. All of our programs are free, but we cannot do what we do without you. So we really encourage and appreciate your financial support. If you'd like to donate, please email us at our email address, webinar@aifl.org, and go to our website, aifl.org/donate, and please make a contribution today. We also recently put out our save the date for our annual Partners for Democracy Awards Gala, which will take place November 7th at the Pierre in New York. We will send you more information about that, but please keep your eyes out for further information about the gala, and we hope to have as many of you join us in person this year as possible. So again, thank you to our amazing audience for your many questions and comments from around the world. It's been really wonderful hearing all your thoughts and all your positive feedback for Unknown and for this program. And we hope to see you at our next webinar next week. So thank you again.